So as language models become more and more impressive, there's been a growing movement to understand their cognitive constructs, like their grammatical generalizations, their reasoning abilities, or theory of mind, or other forms of knowledge that we think are important ingredients of intelligence. The problem is that we can't directly measure knowledge. We can't just take out our trusty AGI-O meter, point it at a model, and get a direct reading of intelligence levels. Instead, all we have access to are evaluations, like benchmarks that claim to be diagnostic of models' abilities, and they spit out some numbers, and we turn them into bar plots, and we take that as a measure of intelligence. But a lesson that we keep learning as a field is that benchmarks are not foolproof, right? We've already seen since the early days of benchmarking that models can be right for the wrong reasons. And an important concept in psychology is constructibility, the idea that we need to make our tests actually measure what we want them to measure. And this seems like a really basic concept, and it is. It's important in any kind of scientific discipline where we're trying to make inferences about latent constructs. But it's received little attention in AI research, I think, in part because the evaluation aspect of language modeling has kind of been a byproduct of engineering and not really adopting scientific first principles. So the central issue, which is the focus of today's talk, is task demands. And these are the auxiliary challenges associated with performing the task, which are separate from the ability that we're actually trying to measure. So as a really simple example, let's say we want to test whether a person or a model can do arithmetic. So we give them a problem like 1 + 2. Now we can make the problem a harder test by including additional operations or making the numbers bigger, for example. But we can also maintain the thing we're testing while increasing the challenges associated with performing the task. For example, by translating it into a word problem or introducing these strange objects. So now the math abilities we're trying to measure are contaminated with other constructs. And these things could be potentially interesting in their own right, like reading comprehension or vocabulary, but the point is that if we're trying to measure math abilities, then our test isn't pure anymore. And importantly, task demands depend on the individual that we're testing. So this might not make the task that much harder for an adult, but it might make it very hard for a child who could otherwise do the simple arithmetic, and it might even make it impossible for a calculator, which obviously can do arithmetic. And bringing this back to language models, we already know from existing work that language models are sensitive to task demands. So you might be familiar with concepts like embers of autoregression or content effects or some of our recent work on metalinguistic prompting. And at the same time, based on research in developmental psychology, we also know that for humans, younger kids are more sensitive to task demands than older kids or adults. And this sensitivity to task demands has been the center of a lot of debate in developmental psychology. So for example, this study argued that children as young as 2.5 years old could succeed at a false belief theory of mind task when task demands were reduced, while they usually fail on the typical kind of tasks that are administered to older children. But other people weren't convinced this was the full story, and there's this whole back and forth debate. And so the point is that task demands are a very real concern in a lot of our evaluations, especially when we're trying to study the cognitive abilities of younger children. So this brings us to our main research question, which is whether a model's sensitivity to task demands will also depend on its overall capacities. So what do I mean by capacity here? We want some way of quantifying a model's overall power or expressiveness not tied to a particular task. And so for kids, we can naturally look at age, and for models here, we're going to consider two different versions of model capacity, size, or the number of parameters, and training time. Okay, so why does this matter? From an NLP perspective, if task demands are masking the abilities of smaller models asymmetrically, then we should reevaluate our claims about emergence, or be careful about claiming when certain cognitive abilities arise in models. And from a cog-sci perspective, it could also suggest new hypotheses about why and when kids will struggle with certain experimental tasks. So let's talk more concretely about what we'll be testing for in our experiments. So first, let's say we just look at raw task performance, like accuracy, as a function of how capable an agent is. So if models pattern like the developmental findings in kids, then we'd expect that performance will increase for high task demands as models get more sophisticated, but then for low task demands, they won't change as much, relatively speaking. So we can take the difference between performance under low and high demand evaluations, which we'll call the demand gap, and we'd expect to see the demand gap decrease as models get more sophisticated. So this is the signature pattern that we'll be testing for in our experiments here. So to test this prediction, we first look at two evaluation contrasts that are relevant to most, if not all, language model evaluations, and each has a high demand and a low demand variant. So the first evaluation contrast that we look at is production versus forced choice, which is a kind of decision point that we have to make in basically all of our evaluations. So conditioned on a context that contains a problem statement for a model, the model's ability to solve the problem is encoded in its next token distributions. But under a production evaluation, the correct answer needs to be likely enough to actually be sampled, and this will depend on the decoding mechanisms. Whereas for a forced choice evaluation, the model only needs to prefer the correct answer over some set of fixed alternatives. And so in that sense, production is a higher demand variant than forced choice. So we compare these contrasting high and low demand variants on two different cognitive constructs. First, we look at analogical reasoning. So we use this digit prediction task. And then we also look at reflective reasoning. And so these are like logic problems where humans show a bias toward an easy intuitive solution, which needs to be overridden to arrive at the correct answer. Okay, and then our second evaluation contrast is the difference between metalinguistic prompting and direct probability measurements. So in our prior work, we've shown that when we're probing language models' linguistic knowledge, models tend to fail when the task is formulated through a prompt that requires some kind of metalinguistic or metacognitive judgment, but they succeed when the task is just to assign higher likelihood to a preferred string form. So what do I mean by that? As a concrete example, let's say we're trying to measure a language model's word prediction abilities. So the kind of like lowest demand or purest way to measure this is just to give the model some like prefix context and then look at its distribution over the next token, right? So we would just give it the beginning of a sentence and look at the probability it assigns to the final word. In contrast, you can also test this same ability through a high-demand metalinguistic prompt. Like, here's the beginning of an English sentence. A butterfly is an insect with 4 large ... What word is most likely to come next? So we test this particular contrast on two different grammatical tasks. The first is word prediction, like we just talked about, and the second is grammaticality judgment. So here the goal is to identify which sentence in a minimal pair is grammatical. And the probability measurement method just compares the probability assigned to the two sentences, and the metalinguistic method explicitly asks in a prompt which sentence is more grammatically correct. Okay, so now we've talked about the evaluation contrasts, and now let's talk about the other part of our predicted pattern, which involves the capability of the agent being tested. So we investigate this by testing 13 open source space language models with varying capabilities. So as I mentioned earlier, we operationalize the idea of capacity in two different ways. First, we vary the size or the number of parameters while keeping other details constant. So we have different sizes within different open source model families. And then we also vary the duration of training. So we look at 10 intermediate checkpoints of a 7B parameter ULMA model. Okay, so let's get to the results. As a reminder, we have two evaluation contrasts, production and forced choice, and metalinguistic versus probability measurements. And then we also have two ways of manipulating a model's capability, size and training time. So let's start by looking at the manipulation of model size. Okay, so let's first just walk slowly through the results on one domain, focusing on analogical reasoning. So this was evaluated using forced choice and production. First, we can look at raw performance. So the y-axis is the proportion of items where the model achieved the correct answer, and the x-axis here is model size, and each facet corresponds to a model family. So here are the raw performance results. We're not interested in raw performance really for our purposes, but generally things make sense. So performance is higher under the lower demand setup, forced choice, and in general, performance tends to increase as model size increases. But if you'll recall, this is the signature pattern that we're looking for. And so on the x-axis here, we have the number of model parameters in a log billion scale, and the y-axis is the difference in log odds between the forced choice and production conditions. So overall, we do find the expected pattern where the demand gap decreases as the number of parameters increases. This holds broadly across all models and within individual model classes, with the exception of Pythia. But those were also trained on an order of magnitude less data than the other models, so that might be one potential reason why it's not patterning the same way. Okay, so we found this pattern for analogical reasoning, and now we can look at the other cognitive constructs. And again, we find the predicted decreasing demand gap pattern for both of our evaluation contrasts, production versus forced choice, and metalinguistic versus probability measurements. So we found the predicted pattern for the manipulation of model size, and now we can turn to training time. So in this setting, it only makes sense to analyze training time dynamics on the cases where the fully trained OMA model actually achieves good performance. So we're just going to look at one domain per evaluation contrast. So we're looking at analogical reasoning for the production versus forced choice contrast, and word prediction for the metalinguistic versus probability comparison. So here we'll just look at performance as a function of training time under both of the evaluation methods. And overall, what we see is consistent what we saw with the model size manipulation. So performance under the low demand evaluation increases more sharply and then plateaus earlier during training, and performance under the high demand evaluation increases more slowly. So to summarize, we found that smaller models, which we operationalized in two different ways, are more sensitive to task demands than larger models or more capable models, and this mirrors findings in developmental psychology with kids. And this connects to recent work suggesting that the phenomenon of emergence in NLP might be attributed to the metrics that researchers choose to use and not necessarily a fundamental phenomenon to model scale. And this work also suggests new ways to study behavioral asymmetries across children and tasks. And this is a direction that we're currently pursuing. So zooming out a bit, the reality is that we can never fully remove task demands. They're always going to be present in any evaluation. But what we can and should do is to try to understand what kind of demands are being imposed by our evaluations and benchmarks, and then adjust our inferences accordingly. And the implications of this will change depending on what our high-level research goals are. So if we're trying to reveal models' knowledge, especially for smaller models, then maybe we want to reduce task demands as much as possible. But if we're trying to be adversarial, then maybe we want to add them in. So again, this depends on our higher-level goals. And finally, the broader takeaway is that the scores that we see in a benchmark are not a direct measure of intelligence. Instead, they reflect models' true underlying abilities through the lens of our design choices. So I think it's important for us as a field to develop more robust scientific frameworks so we can have a better understanding of the true limitations and abilities of these models.